Welcome everyone, I am the Depressed Eeyore, and this is Roll20. Roll20 is a kind of a tabletop emulator site type thing. Some of you guys have probably seen some of my videos using this for Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. It can also be used for some board games. Some people have done Arkham Horror, and in this case I kind of made my own version of Kingdom Death Monster. Kingdom Death Monster is a rather large board game. It's like a card game slash miniatures game, but it's not a collectible game. It just uses a lot of cards and a lot of miniatures, and it's, I guess the best way to describe it as far as like theme is concerned, it's kind of like a mixture of Monster Hunter and Dark Souls. The Monster Hunter aspect, it involves a lot of the going on hunts and hunting down certain monsters, and when you defeat them, you use the parts that you get from the monster to craft additional materials and stuff for your people. The Dark Souls aspect is the more of the setting. This world is essentially a world of darkness. There's no actual natural sunlight usually, and the world is made up of nothing but these really strange stone faces. So like the ground itself is just like some of the buildings that I'll eventually start showing in this game, you'll notice it's made up of nothing but stone faces. Like even here, this battlefield here, it's all stone faces, and then the center here is a stone face as well. And in this world, the way it starts is a bunch of humans kind of just wake up here. They end up like not knowing how they got here or anything, and they don't even know like language or anything, so they're very, very primitive. And a lot of them tend to die almost immediately coming into this world because the monsters eat them. In this world, humans are the bottom of the food chain. And this game's all about not really the individual characters. It's more like kind of similar to something like Darkest Dungeon or XCOM, where yes, the individuals are important, but what's more important is the overall survival of humanity in this case. So what you play in this game is actually an entire civilization of people, a small settlement of humans, if you will. The player characters in this is generally 4 players, and each player would control a hunter whenever they go on hunts. But for the most part, the 4 players just kind of act as kind of the whole voice of how the settlement will be run and how they will interact with the rest of the world around them. In this playthrough, I will be playing by myself, and mostly kind of just showing you guys this game off and stuff like that. If you guys want to see an actual kind of like physical representation of the board game, I definitely recommend Hit Points Gaming YouTube channel. I kind of just stumbled upon it, and he actually plays the physical board game, kind of using like a camera and stuff like that. And so you'll be able to at least be able to see what the figures look like and stuff like that. Through Roll20, I can show a little bit more detail as far as showing cards. It'll be a lot easier for me to pop up cards. I won't have to like wave it in front of a camera or anything like that. I can be like, okay, well, let's figure out what tall grass is. I can just pop it up and click it and be like, okay, this is the card for tall grass. You guys can read it, and I can explain more about it as we go along. So yeah, this is kind of my own personal layout for Kingdom Death Monsters. There is a tabletop simulator version of this game. And it's gotten a lot better since it originally came out. Originally got shut down by the people that own Kingdom Death Monster, but then they allowed it to come back up, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of etchy that way. But unfortunately, the problem with Tabletop Simulator is it doesn't do real well with games that require a lot of writing, like character sheets and things like that. And Roll20 works really well with those types of things. The thing that Roll20 doesn't do as well with is essentially a lot of decks of cards, but I've kind of found my own way of kind of making that work on Roll20, so I'm going to be sticking with Roll20. And for the most part, it's just a little bit easier for me to set up and kind of run things. So I'm going to go. This first video is going to be kind of me showing the general layout of the entire board. It's all one map. So if I zoom all the way out, you can see everything here. Some of this is just some of the characters I've already produced for the introduction here. But I've divided it into 2 halves. The right-hand side, it's all about the settlement. There are 3 phases in this game. There is the hunt phase, which is in the top left corner here. It's this little bar here. It's just you're trying to you're trying to explore the world and trying to find the monster you're hunting. So and the monster may move around on that board. So let me go ahead and zoom in there first, I guess, because I decided to go that direction first. So if we go up here, so this is the hunt track. I've already put some. Originally, it's pretty much blank with the exception of the overwhelming darkness, and depending on what monster you're fighting and at what level, will decide kind of the starting position. The hunters will always start at the start, unless it says otherwise. And then the starting position of the monster depends on the type of monster and its level. So in this case, this monster would start right here. And then based off what sort of monster you're fighting, will decide what cards you lay out. Some of these cards are very generic, like the random event here. That's just a very random event that's pretty much for not specific to any type of monster. But these ones over here, that are the white lion cards, are hunt cards that are specific to the monster that you're fighting. Even though there are multiple types of cards, but I'm going to be just using the represent them. I'm just going to be using this white lion card. So every time I land on one of these, I will flip a card over. And the way I did mention, I have a kind of my own way of handling decks in this game, and the way I do that is, for example, I have a bunch of tabs here. If I pull up White Lion, I have a section called Hunt Events, and it has 8 cards. So instead of having an actual physical deck, I can just roll a 1d8. So I rolled a 5, in which case I would be like, okay, Prowling Lion, I'll pull that up. Be like, okay, and then I just do the event here. If I ever get any duplicates, like in the same hunt, I roll 2 5s in a row, I would just re-roll it. And that's kind of it's kind of the easiest way for me to do this. There is a deck system in Roll20, but I'm still kind of getting used to it, and it doesn't really work well with decks that are. It's not really good for making decks on the fly, which you're going to have to do that. For combat in this game, which we'll kind of get more into a little bit later. But yeah, so the idea, the hunt phase is just this entire little bar up here. If you happen to get to the very end without catching the monster, you will suffer penalties and all that good stuff. If you go to the overwhelming darkness, some funny stuff will happen there. But for the most part, you're just trying to run into this monster, which I have represented as this little figurine here. For all the monsters that we'll be fighting, until I get some tokens or some better images, I'll be using this to represent the monster. Same thing for the battle board here. So I guess I shall move to the showdown phase. So the way the showdown phase works is you have the board. It's always the same size. It's always this layout. The only thing that may change is there's these terrain tiles that may be added to the map. And when they're added to the map, you just put them down here and position them how you like. The monster generally always starts in the center. In fact, I think it always starts in the center. And where you start and where the survivors start really depends on the hunt itself. So there's not really much to say about that. But this will be where most of the action's happening. I'll be moving around. Everything here is grid-based, and it's Manhattan distance, which means there are no diagonals as far as movement is concerned. And the monster will be moving around as well. Facing is important in this game, so we will be keeping track of what direction the monster is facing. Along the left-hand side, I have cards left. The way hit points work for the monster is they have a deck of cards that represents their AI, and every time you do wounds to it, it will remove cards from that deck until there are none left. When there are none left, if you do one more wound, it will kill that monster. So as you do damage to the monster, it will get less and less options, or it may get more and more desperate depending on what cards are left. But for the most part, like for example, the way I have them since I'm not going to be using a deck visible in the game, the way I'll represent how much health the monster has left is these little markers here. So in this case, this monster has 8 cards left, which means you have to do 9 wounds to kill it. Here is just all the tokens. There are positive and negative tokens that are kind of like buffs and debuffs. Whenever any of those become active, I will make a copy of them and bring them down here. There is obviously there's one for strength, speed, accuracy, movement, luck, evasion, toughness, damage, and that's just a weird insanity token thingy. Alright. Also down here in the bottom left, I will also be keeping track of moods, which are a certain type of card that's like an overall effect that remains active for either the entire battle or until it gets removed somehow. On the right hand side is just a bunch of notes to help players keep track of things. So there's a specific six-sided die that the King of Death monsters uses that is a way to keep track of what hit locations you're hitting. But since I'll be using a d6 in the game, I'll just be rolling a d6 and referring to the table here. So 6 is a head, 5 is arms, 4 and 3 are body, 2 is the waist, and 1 is legs. And then this final thing is about survival opportunities, which is specifically for 2 certain abilities that we don't have access to yet. So I will go into that later. Over here is just your terrain tiles. I'll make copies of them and use them whenever we need to. And if we zoom out a little bit, we have 4 survivor character sheets. Also down here, the award resources. This is where I'll keep track of resources that I pick up throughout a hunt or something like that. Anyway, so when you go on a hunt, you'll always take 4 survivors as long as you have that many. If you don't have that many, you'll just send as many as you can. The way I keep track of which characters, which gear grid is with their portraits. So you can see there's Reimu and Mima here. And the way the gear grid works, which I'll go ahead and pull this up here, is it's a 3x3 grid, and each item takes up 1 slot in that 3x3 grid. The reason it's a 3x3 grid is there's actual mechanics involved with how you position and attach the pieces of gear together. At the start of this introduction, we don't really need to worry too much about it. Every character starts with the same gear, and where the position doesn't really matter. But also along the left-hand side has a bunch of notes of just what you can do during a battle. Every character has a movement and an action. You can do them in either order, but if you do a movement first, or you just decide to move, it's all or nothing type thing. So if you move, you can either move your maximum movement, or you can just move 1 or 2 spaces. But in either case, once you stop moving, that's the end of your movement. So you can't do anything like move 2 spaces, then do an action, and then move 3 spaces. There is no spring attack in this. But you can do things like the opposite way, where you do an activation and then move. So you can do them each of those I keep saying actions, but you can do movement and action, or action and movement. There you go. Sorry if that was a little confusing. It also details what you can do with that. So here you can see it says you can move a number of spaces equal to your current movement. If you spend an action, generally what you're going to be spending your action on is activating either a item on your gear grid, a piece of terrain, or some other special rule. And at the end of your action, if you don't spend a movement or an action, it gets wasted. So it's a good idea to go ahead and make do with what you got. Also, it talks about survival actions. There are 4 different survival actions. There's dodge, dash, surge, and encourage. At the start of the game, we're only going to have dodge, which allows you to negate a hit at the cost of 1 survival point. I guess I'll pull up the character sheet in a little bit. But dash and surge and encourage, we do not know yet. I'll explain those when we get them. And then on the bottom left, if you happen to have no weapons on your gear grid, you can always spend an action to activate Fist and Tooth, which is where you literally fight unarmed. And it is what it is. It's generally pretty weak, but it does have higher crit. So for all weapons, they have kind of their own stat values. So let's go ahead and pull that up real quick. So this is a founding stone. Your 4 starting characters always start with 1 founding stone. It's just essentially a shard of stone that you ripped out of the ground in desperation to fight off this monster that's trying to kill you. And all you need to keep track of is in the top left, there are 3 numbers. The first number represents speed. Speed represents how many attacks you have with that weapon. So in this case, it has a speed of 2, which means you would roll 2 dice. Each dice representing a single attack. The next number is the accuracy of the weapon. So in this case, it's 7+. What this means is those attacks that you just rolled, each attack that you get a 7 or higher on is a hit. There are modifiers that can influence both speed and accuracy, so you just have to take those into account when you attack. And then the final number is strength. Much like, I guess, Warhammer type games, you have to hit and succeed in wounding the target. It's not enough just to hit these things, so you have to hit them and somehow and actually manage to pierce their hide. And so what this final number represents is strength. And what you do is when you hit, you're going to draw a hit location, and you're going to try to wound that location. To wound that location, you have to roll a die and add your strength to it. And if your total roll meets or beats the monster's toughness, you succeed in wounding. Otherwise, you fail. And failing to wound can have some very drastic consequences in this game, because sometimes if you fail to wound a certain location, that gives the monster an opportunity to hit you back for free. So it's pretty brutal. This game is, like I said, kind of like Dark Souls, and it's also like Dark Souls in the fact that it's very, very harsh. Throughout the game, you'll probably get attached to certain characters, or at least I will, and what's going to inevitably happen is that character's just going to die. It could be from the battle, from just taking some really harsh hits, or they could just die from a random event that just wrecks them. And that's just kind of part of the game, because this is not about individuals as much as it is about ensuring the entire survival of the human race at this point. Anyway, the additional things that I found, all gear in your gear grid will have is a bunch of keywords. So in this case, it's a weapon, a melee weapon, and it's made out of stone. Some of these keywords can have certain factors and certain events. And then, of course, some weapons have special abilities. Like in this case, I could spend an action to throw it, in which case I sacrifice the item, and I sacrifice my weapon in exchange for automatically hitting and automatically critting with the weapon. But then I would be stuck with fighting with my hands and feet for the rest of the battle. So if this is a little long-winded, I just kind of want to explain as much as I can. Let's go ahead and pull up the character sheet real quick. So the people that made Kingdom Death Monster were kind enough to provide links to this electronic character sheet, which allows me to manipulate characters and save the URL, so I don't have to worry about writing everything down on paper. It also makes it a lot easier to show you guys. So, in the top left, you got your name and gender. Gender does have some importance in this game because there is things like mating in this game, because you have to keep the population of your settlement up. The next spot is survival. Naming your character, you generally will start with 0 survival, but you can get a point of survival by naming your character. So that's what I did right there. In the right-hand side, as you learn new survival moves, you'll check these boxes, and they will become available to you. Right now, all we can do is dodge. And if we decide to use something like dodge, we have to spend a survival point. And if you don't have any survival points, you can't do any of these actions. Also, if you get injured in certain ways, that can also prevent you from ever using survival again, which can be pretty detrimental. Stat-wise, you're human and you suck. You start out with 5 movement points and 0s in all your stats. So there are ways to increase your stats through leveling up and various innovations and certain events that may give you just a permanent stat increase. They're pretty tough to get, but they are always pretty good to get if you can keep that character alive. Next is all wounding locations. The first one is the brain. In this game, there is sanity mechanics. As you see crazy things or get terrified and things like that, you will take what they call brain damage. The first brain damage that you take will fill in this box. Any damage you take beyond that will cause you to roll on a table that could cause you to do anything from having a heart attack and dying to going kind of crazy and just going on a frenzy. The way you can protect your brain is with insanity. As you get more insane, you kind of get used to the dark world of darkness that is around you. So, as you get points of insanity, it is essentially armor for your brain. So instead of filling in this box, you will just start reducing this insanity until you don't have any left, and in which case, then you'll fill in the box. Now, there's one key thing about insanity, is if you ever have 3+ insanity, you are classified as insane. And being insane can have certain beneficial and detrimental effects on you, depending on what equipment you have and what events are occurring. So be aware of that. Now, the rest of these are physical hit locations. You got the head, arms, body, waist, and legs, like I mentioned before. Each location, with the exception of the head, has a light wound location and a heavy wound location. When you take that first point of damage in a certain location, you'll fill in that first box. If you take another one, you fill in another box. You'll fill in a number of boxes equal to the amount of damage you've taken. So if you've taken 1 point of damage, you just fill in one box. But if you take 2 in one hit, you fill in both. Now, taking a light wound doesn't really do anything, but if you take a heavy wound, as it says underneath all of these, heavy injury means knocked down. So if you take a heavy injury in any hit location, your character will be knocked down, which can limit your abilities to do anything for a while. Now, just like with Insanity, you can equip pieces of armor, and that will protect your that particular hit location. So if you get hit in the arms and you have 3 armor there, you'll start reducing that before you take any actual real damage. Also, just like with brain damage, if you fill in all the boxes and you take additional damage beyond that, you will have to roll on a table, and it can do stuff based off what hit location you get hit in. So for arms, you could die. You can lose an arm. You can just take some bleeding. It's a lot of things. Like if you hit in the body, you can break a rib, and so forth. Now the head is a little bit more vulnerable because it doesn't have a light hit location. Also, any severe injuries you take to the head have a much higher chance of killing you. About 40% chance compared to the other locations. Also, the body's a little bit more vulnerable because it has twice as likely to get hit compared to the other hit locations. So be aware of that when you start gearing up your characters. In the top right up here, you have your hunt XP. Every time you succeed in a hunt, you'll be filling in these boxes. And every time you fill in one of these bold boxes, it will trigger an age event, which is essentially like a level up, which will give you some random stuff. Once you get through the first level, you can actually get proficiency in a weapon. So you can be like, I am proficient in sword. And as you succeed in using your weapon, you can eventually level up your proficiency and become a specialist and even a master, which can give you various benefits depending on what weapon type you're using. Courage and understanding. Courage is pretty much just straight up bravery. This can have some various influences on various encounters. It also, when you get 3 points and max it out, both of those will lead to a specific story event, which can give you a variety of abilities. Some of those abilities include what are listed down here, which if you get one of them, you'll just check in the boxes. Understanding is kind of your character's insight of the world around him. So as you build up more understanding, you'll trigger some events, which can get you more abilities. Pretty straightforward. This might seem like there's a lot of front-loaded information, but what you actually do in the game is actually very straightforward. So that's why I'm just putting all this in part 0 here. Anyway, next you have fighting arts, which is just special abilities that are pretty situational or very unique. You can only have up to 3 of them at a time. If you get any more than 3, you have to replace one. Also, certain injuries can keep you from using them. Disorders are kind of like brain disorders that can be beneficial or detrimental depending on which one you get, or both. For example, you can get something where you're very afraid of sharp objects, in which case your character will refuse to use any bladed weapons. There's also one where you are extremely honorable, and so you'll never attack a monster when they're knocked down or from behind. And there's, stuff like that. You can have up to 3 disorders. If you get any more, you can replace one. And then the final part is kind of for generic stuff, abilities and impairments. So if you get like broken arms or lose a limb or get something that's otherwise not a fighting art or disorder, you will list down here. Over here, if you ever have to skip the next hunt, you just fill in that box there, and that just means you will not participate in the next hunt. Alright, so that is the gear grids, hunt board, showdown board, and over here on the right, well, also down here, I just have this is where I'll keep all the portraits of named survivors that I may or may not use in a hunt. Anyway, over here is the settlement board. The settlement board is generally just a very, very big sheet of paper as far as the actual game is concerned. So what I did is I kind of made it a little bit more visual so you guys can kind of see what's going on. In the top left, we'll have the name of our settlement, which naming our settlement does give us a small benefit at the start of the game. Then lantern years just represents what year it is for our characters. There is a timeline, and as we progress through the timeline, it will trigger various things. Survival limit represents your maximum survival, which is generally based off whatever innovations you have. So right now, we don't technically have a settlement at the start, so our survival limit is 1. Departing survival is just just represents how much survival you'll get if you are a hunter that departs. Sometimes it starts at 0, but again, there are ways to get more. Principles represent kind of your overall your settlement's overall ideals. As certain events, certain situations occur, it will trigger various events, and during those events, you will have to make a certain choice. Yeah, and that's pretty much all there is to say about that. It will, depending on what choices you do, it will influence kind of how you play the rest of the game. Innovations, I've used this term a few times already. Innovations is your tech tree in this game. Like I mentioned before, when you start the game, your people don't even know language yet. And the first thing we will learn is going to be language. But as you when you learn something like language, as you can see, language here will increase the survival limit, which means we will get another little lantern under survival limit and make our max survival 2. We also get the ability to encourage, which means I would check that box and be like, okay, I can now encourage with my survival points. But the main thing it also does is it adds language consequences to the innovation deck. The technology deck in this, the technology in this game is sort of randomized. It is in a deck. So those language consequences, there are 6 of them. There's ammonia, drums, hovel, inner lantern, paint, and symposium, which I've already pulled out ahead of time. So this represents our entire our innovation deck, and there's something you can do in this game called innovate. You can do this generally once per year, and it costs a good number of your resources, but doing so allows you to draw 2 cards from your innovation deck, and then you pick one to innovate and add to your innovations. So, for example, this deck is 6 cards right now. If I wanted to innovate, I would do a 2d6, and I would take I would go from left to right. So the first one would be ammonia, and the fourth one is inner lantern. And what I would do is I'd be like, okay, this is ammonia, this is inner lantern. I compare them, and I pick which one is best for our settlement. Now, what choice I pick will influence what sort of stuff we get out of it. For example, if I picked Inner Lantern, it would give us the ability to use Surge. If I picked Ammonia, we would get an additional +1 survival when we depart, which is it's essentially free points. But the additional thing is, just like with language, each of these have their own consequences. So if I picked Ammonia, I would remove Ammonia from the innovation deck, move it up here, and then I would pull up the ammonia consequences over here, which is bloodletting and lantern oven, in which case I would add those to the innovation deck. So my deck of 6 cards now became 7, because I removed 1 and added 2. So as you learn various aspects of the tech tree, it will expand the options that you have in your innovation deck. And as you go further down those trees, essentially, I guess you call them branches, you will get more and more, I guess you can call them important or more influential innovations. If you tend to go very spread out with your innovations, your deck will definitely become very bloated, but you'll also have an infinite amount of options as far as what you can pick from the draw. All right, so I think that's about it. The only other thing I haven't talked about is the endeavors. Endeavors represent your actions that you can do for the settlement. Usually this represents things like innovating. Innovating requires an endeavor, so you would have to use one of these to actually innovate. Also, building various structures, such as other locations, usually require endeavors as well. Some of these also require resources, which you would have to expend as well. The amount of endeavors you get is usually based off the number of survivors that come back from a hunt. So it's usually 1 for 1. So if you have 4 survivors on the hunt and they all come back, you get 4 endeavors back. There are a few other ways to get endeavors, but that is the primary means. Settlement locations is each location kind of has their own abilities, and you can do stuff with them. As you get more locations, you'll get more options. A lot of these locations are generally crafting areas, which will allow you to craft various things like armor and weapons, which is generally very important because you can't just survive on shards of stone. Down here, I just keep track of my resources and any spare gear I may have. And then on the bottom here, I will have all the portraits of every character that has died. Because the game actually wants you to keep track of how many people have died. And that's pretty much it. So the reason I wanted to talk about this video is to kind of give a little bit of a layout of the rules of the game, as well as kind of my general layout of what's going on here. As you can, don't get too intimidated by all of the folders here. It's just my way of being able to show it to the players that I play with, and for you guys to actually see stuff. So, for example, if I got a level up, I would be like, okay, here's the image from the book. By the way, there's a book here. There's a PDF for it, which shows all that fun stuff. And then I'll be like, all right, there's the image, and then I would pull this up, which is a page from the book, and be like, okay, this is what happens. I need to roll this stuff, and then I would roll it and do whatever is required for it. So there you go. That being said, let me go ahead and give a kind of a warning for everyone. This game does have some graphic images of either gore and a little bit of nudity. So just be aware of that, so that some of it may or may not be safe for work. So just be aware of that. For the most part, I don't really have an issue with it. I don't think it's too bad. Some of the art style is kind of anime-ish and a little, in some cases, a little fan surfacey, but there's far worse out there in the internet, so I'm not that concerned about it. Also, I'm going to go ahead and say it here, but I'll probably also say it in the beginning of the next part. I will be house ruling at least one card, which is one of the principles. I'll explain why in the future, but as far as that particular choice, it's a non-choice because it's so unbalanced. So I'm going to give a little bit more oomph towards one of the cards to make it a little bit more viable. I've already kind of decided what I'm going to be picking, so I'm not too concerned about that. As for the characters, for the most part, they're going to be mostly female because I happen to have a lot of Toho pictures. Go figure. I do have a few males, of course. You have to have males and females because you have to be able to breed in this game. But anyway, I guess the final thing I'm going to go ahead and do is, if you guys have watched this far already, I thank you greatly for enjoying this. It'll go a little bit better in the future. The way the parts are going to be divided up is by phases and years. So the first thing that's going to be happening is going to be year 0 showdown, and then I'll be doing year 1 settlements, year 1 hunt, and then year 1 showdown again. It'll just be in order of that. So some parts are going to be much longer than others based off the phase. Generally, the hunt phase is going to be pretty short. Yeah, so that's pretty much the gist of it. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and read the introduction. So if we pull up the actual book here, as it kind of gives a little bit of details here and all that good stuff, but no worries there. So it does tell you to go ahead and read the prologue. So we shall do that. I'll zoom out a little bit. There we go. That should be good. So showing some of the pictures. So yeah, like I mentioned before, it's a world of darkness, and all the people in this on this world wake up with a lantern, and that's kind of their only source of light. And you can see that there's all the stone faces around it. Once upon a time, there was a place of carved stone faces. A man with a lantern lay sleeping a dreamless sleep. The man knew nothing. One day, actually, let me zoom out a little bit so you guys can actually see the picture. There we go. One day the man woke up. He rubbed the dried ink caked over his eyes and opened them. Around him he saw other people stirring, and beyond a horizon of unbroken darkness. A woman approached the man with a lantern. Her soft hand reached out to him. They had no words. They were a mystery to each other. Suddenly, a monster emerged from the darkness, its eyes wild with hunger. It attacked. The people were no match for the monster. It tore their flesh and crushed their bones between its teeth. Some it devoured whole. Overcome with terror and grief, the man with the lantern collapsed to the ground. Cold stone noses pushed into his side. There was no escape. But the man did not want to die. Desperately grasping at the cold stone faces, he felt a crack and tore at it with all his might. A piece of stone came free. It was sharp and deadly. The man with the lantern scrambled to his feet, his weapon clenched in his fist. He took a deep breath and roared into the darkness. Somewhere in the place of stone faces, nameless men stand together. They have nothing but a need to survive and a lantern to light their struggle. And this just talks about the first story. And the way this starts is those 4 survivors are going to try to fight. As you can see, there is that anime style here. It's also talking about assembling the miniatures and stuff like that. But you do start right off the bat fighting a white lion. This one is a hard-coded one. Generally, you randomize the cards, so the AI deck is different every time. But for the first fight, it is hard-coded to have these 8 cards. And the first card is always going to be Claw. The rest of it gets shuffled. Also, for the hit location deck, it gets shuffled, but the first hit location is always going to be Strange Hand. And that's going to be pretty much it. I just wanted to point that out. Go ahead and do the intro. I apologize for the video being so long. I had to kind of explain kind of my layout so you guys can kind of see things a little bit easier. Next time we will go straight into the combat, and hopefully I don't just flat out die. I'll go ahead and make a promise right now. I will try not to rage quit. So, I am the Depressed Eeyore, and this was Kingdom Death Monster. See you guys later.